people interpret that as taco, meaning Trump always chickens out. It's the exact opposite. He's basically trading off lower tariffs for U.S. interest abroad coming in the U.S. direction. So again, UK was not alone at begging for lower tariffs. Pretty much every country was, but that was the whole purpose of the design of the higher tariffs in the first place.
Now, President Trump has announced a new wave of tariffs on more than 80 countries that range from 10% to 12.5%, include some of the US's biggest trading partners like Canada, Mexico and China. The Trump administration says it's designed to combat forced labour. Well, let's hear now from Gavin Bade, Wall Street Journal trade and economic policy reporter, who's on the line. Good afternoon, Gavin.
Good afternoon. Good to be with you.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show. So the pretext that Donald Trump has used is that he's hitting countries with tariffs if they haven't tackled trade in goods using forced labour. It's quite clearly, though, isn't it, a legal ruse to get round, the Supreme Court striking down the old tariffs, isn't it?
Yes, quite. You said pretext, and it is exactly that. So what happened here was back in February, listeners will remember the Supreme Court said most of Donald Trump's tariffs were illegal. They struck them down, they threw them out. And so immediately Trump put a temporary tariff, 10% on every nation, in place. That tariff was set to expire today. And so these forced labor tariffs, so-called forced labor tariffs, were put in place to replace the expiring tariff. So a lot of moving parts here, but he's just rebuilding the tariff wall that was struck down by the Supreme Court.
And you've written about how these new tariffs are designed to withstand legal scrutiny, so presumably hoping that these new ones won't get struck down. Just explain that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is using a much more tried and true section of tariff law. It's called Section 301. It allows the president to impose tariffs on countries that discriminate against U.S. goods. And the way it's written is pretty broad. If the United States Trade Representative does a proper investigation and writes a report and offers time for comment, they can basically do whatever they want under this law. And so that is what we've seen USTR, the Trump administration, do. While this temporary tariff was in place, they did this investigation into supposed forced labor in global supply chains. They say that, that discriminates against U.S. companies who don't use forced labor, and so they justify the tariff that way. So although people around the world may raise their eyebrows at that justification, I think it will withstand legal muster in the U.S.
And perhaps you could settle a dispute I had with our U.S. assistant editor earlier about whether the UK comes out of this worse than the EU, because I read something this afternoon that said that the EU's got this 10% all-inclusive deal for tariffs on its goods. The UK, though, is facing 10% universal tariffs on top of duties imposed on individual goods. And it sounds nerdy, but if the UK is worse off than the EU under this new regime, that seems pretty sort of rough, given that the previous Prime Minister Keir Starmer spent so much time cozying up to Donald Trump.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, under the previous tariff regime, before the Supreme Court decision, the UK was in a better position. You had a 10% tariff, while the European Union had a 15% on a lot of their goods. Right now, the UK and the EU roughly equal, right? It does depend a little on product class, but both have 10% tariffs based on the most recent round of tariffs. But there are more to come. There's another Section 301 investigation that the Trump administration is doing into alleged industrial overproduction. That could result in other tariffs. And then there are always all of these separate so-called national security tariffs on individual industries. This is steel, aluminum, automobiles. There are more of those investigations coming down the pike as well. So this tariff story really doesn't end with the Trump administration. It just iterates over and over in slightly different ways.
And sorry, just to be clear then, the EU is slightly better off than it was, and the UK is worse off than it was, or the same?
I would say the UK is about the same. The EU does look to be doing a little bit better, but, they're in hot water over their fine of, they fined Google over $1 billion this week. And we saw actually yesterday as well, USTR kind of issue a warning statement saying if you don't do something and stop, as they say, discriminating against these U.S. firms, then, that whole agreement that they had on tariffs and investment could be off. So all of these things, it's very much a moving target.
I'd say in the fact check, you've come down on my side over our US editor, so that's always good to know.
But of course,
not being petty, of course. Where do you see this going? Then you've talked about all these uncertainties. And how does it play for Trump domestically? This.
I think, prices are high in the U.S. because of the Iran war. Tariffs only add to that. There's a lot of economic frustration with Trump right now. His numbers on the economy and inflation are like as bad as Joe Biden's were, basically. And he's really suffering, suffering in the polls because of this stuff. I think where it goes from here is we're going to see some more tariffs. I mentioned that other tariff investigation. So Trump has about made it halfway into rebuilding the tariff wall that was struck down by the Supreme Court. This latest round of tariffs is going to get him about half the tariff revenue that he did before, maybe a little more. But they're going to come back with more tariffs and get that average tariff rate up. This has been their plan all along. I think we'll end up seeing the U.S. effective tariff rate, the average, be around 17%. That's where it was before the Supreme Court decision as well. So more to come on this front.
But those ratings don't bode well for the midterms at all, do they, for him?
No, absolutely not. And the question is, can the Democrats get themselves together and get an economic message that resonates with voters? I think there's a lot of soul searching in that party right now as well. So,
that's a big question. That's a big question. Gavin, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
That was Gavin Bade, Wall Street Journal trade and economic policy reporter. Let's turn now to Tomas Philipson, who's former economic advisor to Donald Trump during his first term. Tomas, good afternoon.
Good to be with you.
Come back to Trump and the midterms where we left off there with Gavin and his ratings. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. But first of all, what do you make of this latest batch of tariffs? Is it good policy or not?
Well, I think it continues pretty much what he was doing since he was struck down by the Supreme Court in a particular form of tariff. These tariffs are easier to implement for him, are not time limited, and they don't have an overall ceiling of 15%, which the one he adopted after the Supreme Court decision. But the key here, I think, which people are not focusing on, is that this is for countries that import from other countries forced labor or goods that are produced with forced labor. And the background to that, I think, is it's what we call a secondary tariff. It's basically the country itself doesn't have to have forced labor, but if they import from countries that have forced labor, they will be hit by U.S. tariffs. The target here, in my view, is China, which the Labor Department here has established has forced labor in 10 industries, and also have their prison camps that engaged in labor. That's a non-competitive ways to produce things, because obviously if you force people, you don't have to pay them as much, and therefore you can charge lower prices for your goods. So I think that's the indirect targets. China's exports, despite U.S. Tariffs on China, have been rising the last year, and this is one way to basically discipline their or hurt their exports with other countries than the U.S.
It's interesting, I assumed when the phrase forced labour was used, and obviously there is, as I was discussing with Gavin, it's a bit of a pretext for Trump to get the tariffs he wants, but I immediately thought it must be targeting China. But the problem is he's also targeting a whole load of allies at the same time, isn't he? And let's just look at the UK position, where the EU, as we've been hearing just now, is slightly better off than the UK is now, and so, it's better off than it was. And so, it just feels to me, what is the UK getting out of this relationship that they've been tiptoeing around? The last Prime Minister was very careful not to offend Donald Trump. Hasn't really got us very far, has it?
Well, I mean, the whole purpose of the tariff, the initial increase of tariffs that occurred last year was to essentially get countries to negotiate with the U.S. on what we feel are unfair treatment of U.S. firms relative to how friendly we are to foreign firms in the U.S., essentially. And that essentially had 130 countries bang on the door of the U.S. trade representative and wanted to negotiate, including the UK. So UK is certainly not the only country who's trying to be nice to the U.S. to basically get rid of this leverage. The whole point there was to create leverage for the president to negotiate with other countries. If you negotiate and do what we desire, your tariffs will come down, which is essentially what happened over time. people interpret that as taco, meaning Trump always chickens out. It's the exact opposite. He's basically trading off lower tariffs for U.S. interest abroad coming in the U.S. direction. So again, UK was not alone at begging for lower tariffs. Pretty much every country was, but that was the whole purpose of the design of the higher tariffs in the first place.
So what would be your advice to the new Prime Minister in the UK, Andy Burnham, about how to handle Donald Trump? Should he carry on trying to be nice, or should he be a bit tougher, and Donald Trump might respect that?
I don't think trade wars is the way to go with, because U.S. has such leverage, and that's the whole, again, the realization of the Trump administration, even from the first administration on to the second Trump administration, which is that a lot of countries benefit a lot more trading with us than we trading with them. We are a very self-sufficient country in terms of the share of GDP that's imports and exports relative to other countries. It's much smaller for us. We mainly trade with ourselves, meaning U.S. citizen to U.S. citizen, as opposed to other countries who trade with foreign countries a lot more. So therefore, the trade wars hurt other countries a lot more than they hurt the U.S. And that's the whole leverage that makes, I believe, that we haven't seen the trade wars take place since Trump raised the tariffs quite dramatically last year.
Well, just finally, there's been, I know, some consternation in America about the appointment of the UK's new Foreign Secretary, Ed Miliband. I wonder what you made of him, what the vibe is.
I don't have a particular insight into him in particular, but I do think your bond markets are pretty harsh on trying to cut government taxes. Essentially, you have a lot of prime ministers in the last few years, and one got ousted very quickly through the bond markets, essentially. But I don't have a particular view on this one, but I think actions is certainly not, the direction of the country that's envisioned by the new prime minister is certainly not a free market economist like myself is viewing as desirable.
Tomas Philipson, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Former economic advisor to Donald Trump during his first term there.